Okay, so Be'ezras Hashem, tonight we're going to be continuing with our series of Shirim on entering the Sea of Wisdom, based on the weekly Torah, on the entire Torah that the Tzaddik, the Gaon, Rav Yitzchak Meyer Morgenstern Shlita reveals and we're zochet to receive every week, whether it comes directly to our mailbox or if we have to go searching for it. But again, like any other week, the amount of teachings we could have focused on was immense. But there was something that piqued my interest because, as we're going to see, it's one of my favorite sugyos in the annals of Hasidic thought. So I said, if the Rebbe is bringing this up, then it's kedai for me to grab hold of the opportunity to teach a little bit about this Nakuda. But really, the first teaching in the Likutei Divrei Elokim Chaim, so the collected teachings that have been given over in Parsha Shoftim in the past, was a 24-piece, teaching that the Rebbe had given over, a drasha of sorts, in previous years, and that's what the Talmidim brought down in this week's Nishmas and Chadasin. So, Bekitzer, what the Rebbe speaks about very often when it comes time for Elul is the sixth teaching in the Likutei Maharan, which is known as the teaching of Tshuva, primarily because the teaching of Tshuva is the teaching about how a person needs to learn how to engage in a process of running and returning in their relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ratza v'shov. That a person, if they want to enter into the process of tshuva, so then they need to become a baki, an expert in ratza, a baki in running forward towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu, like we spoke about last week, the desire to move forward and to connect through positive commandments and adding more. But as important, if not more important, is also the ability to be a baki b'shov, to be an expert in what it means to return back to oneself, to stop running, to stop feeling like there's so much more that I need to accomplish, but rather to rest calmly within myself. Now, that does not come to push against the notion of moving forwards, because Ratza v'shov kamare habazek, as the pasuk says by the vision of the Merkava by Yecheskel, that a person needs both an expertise in running forward, as well as an expertise in running backwards. And based on the Arizal, the word baki times 2 is going to be the gematria of derech, which is the kavanos of the month of Elul, which is hanoisin biyam derech, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu places a pathway for us, an impossible pathway in the midst of the stormy sea, that there's an impossible pathway that emerges, and that pathway, that derech, is built on the two expertise, the two kochos that a person needs to understand of running forward to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but also a willingness to retreat back into ourselves with an awareness that that's also part of tshuva. That's also part of the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, what Rabbi Nachman points out, based on the Arizal, is that these two elements of tshuva are represented in the letter Aleph. The letter Aleph, as we know, the first letter which contains every other utterance, as the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh teaches us, and all of the tzaddikim tell us, that the letter Aleph is really comprised of a vav, a slanted vav in the middle, an upper yud, and a lower yud, which equals the gematria of 26, which is the four-letter name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But for our purposes, what Rabbi Nachman does is he says that the lower yud is what it means to be a baki in returning to oneself, in struggling with Avodas Hashem. That lower yud represents our relationship with God when things are difficult. The upper yud represents our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu when things are going well. And the vav in the middle is the chibor, or the connectivity between those two polarizing elements of Avodas Hashem. And when they can join together properly, and both the upper yud and the lower yud, the baki in running forward and the baki in returning backwards, they merge together into one, which is the deep kavana of Elul. This, Rabbi Nachman says, corresponds to the 3 mitzvos that the Jewish people are commanded prior to their entrance into Eretz Yisrael. What we need to do is, number 1, we need to destroy Amalek. Number 2 is we need to build the Beis HaMikdash. And number 3 is that we need to appoint for ourselves a king. Now, what Rabbi Nachman and the Rebbe spend a lot of time doing is aligning these 3 mitzvos with the 3 elements of this Os Aleph. The lower Yud, which represents our confrontation with difficulty and struggle and concealment, represents the idea of getting rid of Amalek, getting rid of Hester, getting rid of concealment in our lives, knowing what it means to return back into ourselves, to find Hashem not in our transcendent quest, but rather in our willingness to be present within ourselves. If a person is zoiche to get rid of Amalek, then they go up to the upper Yud, which is the avodah of building the Beis Hamikdash. That's the avodah of finding HaKadosh Baruch Hu wherever I am at. In the moment that I'm running forward to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I build for myself the Beis Hamikdash at that point. And the Vav, which is the equilibrium or the unity between the two that can hold the polarizing opposites of running forward and returning backwards, is the mitzvah of Minoi HaMelech, of appointing a king, which is connecting to the Tzaddik Emes, connecting to the truly righteous individual, connecting to Moshe Rabbeinu Raya Mehemna, connecting to the Neshama of Mashiach. So we have these three elements of Avodas Hashem: running forward, which is the upper Yud, returning backwards, which is the lower Yud, and the unity between those two elements of Avodas Hashem, which is the Vav. Those also represent the three mitzvot, which is the lower Yud represents getting rid of Amalek, finding Hashem even in difficulty. The upper Yud represents building the Beis Hamikdash, finding HaKadosh Baruch Hu in calmness. And the Vav represents connecting to the king, connecting to the Tzaddik Emes, connecting to Moshe Rabbeinu, which is the main way that we have a connectivity to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Rebbe now goes on, and he does even more with this. He says that in truth, these three elements of the Ois Aleph, or the three elements of what it means to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the world, also represent three reasons that are given in the Arizal for the creation of the world itself. The lower Yud represents the lowest level of Hashem's purpose for creating the world, which is Ki Choy Katov Lahetiv, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as the Arizal points out in Shar HaKlalim, and as the Ramchal makes very clear as the essential point, the Baal HaSulam also does this, that the purpose of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's creation is because the good, capital G good, the Tov HaAmiti, wants to bestow goodness upon his creatures, and the only way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu can bestow true goodness that is not received with shame of not having earned it, not experiencing Nehemeg Dekisufa, the bread of shame, is through Bechira. That's the lower Yud. That's where we encounter difficulty. That's where we struggle for the sake of revealing HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The next reason given for the Arizal is that the purpose for the creation of the world was so that we as human beings can become a Merkava, a resting place for the Shekhinah, that our lives can become so translucent and so spiritually refined that ultimately there's really no distinction between who we are and the Ratzon of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the upper Yud. That corresponds to the mitzvah of building the Beis Hamikdash. That corresponds to the purpose of creation, which is to become a Merkava for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the third and final reason, which is hinted to in the writings of the Arizal, but expressed most explicitly in the writings of Chasidus, as expressed in the Medrash Chazal in Parshas Vayakel, is that Ratza HaKadosh Baruch Hu lihiyos lo dira betachtonim, that what HaKadosh Baruch Hu desires, what HaKadosh Baruch Hu truly wants, so to speak, is to create a dwelling place for himself, specifically in the lowest imaginable reason of creation, in the lowest spaces, that it's specifically from the human being themselves, from us who are so far from Kedusha, from us who are so far from clarity. It's specifically out of our darkness and our concealment that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to reveal the ultimate purpose of the Giloi Kvod Shemayim. So what we have is the three elements of the Os Aleph. We have the lower Yud, which corresponds to the experience of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in this world, the struggle, the need to defeat Amalek, which also corresponds to the aspect of Memale Kol Almin, our awareness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu from a lower human perspective. We're aware that Hashem gives life to all of existence, but existence still means something to us. That's the experience of struggling for Hashem. Then the upper Yud, which represents the purpose of creation, which is that we become a Merkava for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That represents Soiviv Kol Almin. At that place, it's clear to us that Hashem is everything. It's clear to us that we're mevutal and we nullify ourselves in the face of Hashem. And that's the Binyan Beis HaMikdash. And then the Vav, which is the mitzvah of Minui HaMelech, is V'leis asar panui minei. That's the recognition that Mamalik Kalalman, Silviv Kalalman, Hashem fills all worlds, Hashem surrounds all worlds. In truth, both are true, and that there's absolutely nothing other than HaKadosh Baruch Hu whatsoever anywhere. That level is the reason Keneged Ratza HaKadosh Baruch Hu lios lo dira betachtoinim. So the Rebbe again goes through a long arichas about all three of these elements and beautiful ideas of basically from the beginning of Torah Sasoid to the end of Torah Sasoid, associating it all with this letter Aleph. But for our purposes, what we're going to look at is the way that the Rebbe explains it according to the first pasuk of this week's parsha of Shoiftim v'Shaitrim Titim L'cha B'chol Sharecha. So the Rebbe says as follows in Os Yudches: Hatzadikim ma'alim es b'nei Yisrael l'titein l'cha shar hanun, which is the or of Soiviv Kol Almin. The first darga, says the Rebbe, darga aleph shal giloi ha'or d'memala Kol Almin, the revelation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's light in a way where we know he's here, although we still feel ourselves, shehi b'chinas hatachlis d'lehetiv lebruav, which corresponds to the purpose of creation, which is that Hashem wanted to bestow goodness upon his creatures, which, like we said, is the lower yud of the aleph, which is the mitzvah of mechias hamalech. Yecholim b'nei Yisrael lekabel mitzad atzmam. They can do this on their own. Ve'ein sarich lazeh kol kach esa hiskarvus l'tzadikei ha'emes, which are the shoiftim v'shoitrim. For that level, for the lower yud, a person doesn't need to connect themselves necessarily to the true tzadikei hadoros. Ella dehat tzadikei ha'emes ma'alim es b'nei Yisrael mikoydem el tachlis habeis titein lecha, which is the kedusha of Shar Hanun. But in truth, in order to reach the second yud, in order to reach the second purpose of creation, which is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to become a merkava for him in this world, that we need the tzaddikim, that we need the shoiftim v'shoitrim. Why? It's v'titein lach, to draw us up to the level of lach. Lach, which is lamed and chaf, is gematria nun, which is the kedusha of Shar Hanun, the kedusha of Soiviv Kol Almin, shenikra b'lashon ha'arizal yichud hashvil v'hanesiv yichud da'aba v'ima shekanal hu kenegatachlis habeiz shalios lemerkava etzlo. Okay, so those are the first two reasons. The first two reasons for HaKadosh Baruch Hu desiring the creation of the world is choy katov lahetiv. That corresponds to Memala Kol Almin. That corresponds to a lower level of unity. That corresponds to the lower yud of the aleph. Then there's the second level, which is the upper yud of the aleph. That corresponds to the next level of the upper unity, the yichud ilah, the soiviv kol almin. That corresponds to the mitzvah of binyan beis hamikdash and the purpose of creation at that level, which is to become a merkava for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But but in truth, the real purpose that we have to engage in, which is what? Which is that third level, which corresponds to the vav that connects both yuds, that corresponds to leis asar panimine, where the lower unity and the upper unity are unified because both of them bespeak the infinitude of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence above and below at once. The real purpose is to reach the level v'shaftu es ha'am mishpat tzedek, to reach the level of righteousness. Why? Because tzedek represents malchus. Tzedek represents malchus, which is the lowest imaginable level where we find ourselves in this world. Shehi haremez el malchus hagnuza beradla, which is in truth the remez to the loftiest imaginable level, which is the malchus that is concealed within Reisha Deloas Yada, something that no other tzaddik has spoken about nearly as much as the Rebbe has. To begin to try and explain a little bit of what it means for our context would take us far beyond what we're discussing now. But suffice it to say that the word tzedek, righteousness, which represents the lowest experience in this world, the need to be kind, the need to be engaging with morals and ethics and interpersonal relationships and engagements and doing things the right way in this worldliness, is in truth a remez to the loftiest source of malchus, which is rooted where? In Reisha Deloas Yada, the highest possible imaginable place, which corresponds to Ratza HaKadosh Baruch Hu lios lo dir betachtoinim. That in truth, the ikar reason is that Hashem wants to reveal himself specifically from within the confinement and the concealment and the greatest imaginable concealment. Like we saw in the name of the Balatanya in Parak Lamed Vav, in the Choshech HaKafel U'Mechupel, or what Rabbi Nachman points out as the Hastara Shabbatoicha Hastara, it's specifically down here in the Dir Betachtoinim. That is represented in the Malchus that is Mushrash and Reisha Deloas Yada, that impossibility of understanding why things are the way they are. That's the darga of Reish Lo Yada. The recognition that human beings ultimately know absolutely nothing, because in truth, all we have is the recognition of emuna. V'hainu sha'atachlis ha'elyona, the elevated purpose for the creation of the world. Hishema'alim hatzadikim, who are the shoftim v'shoitrim. Tzadikim bring us up to the level of that highest level of malchus, of revealing how the lowest level is in truth the site of the highest level. Hainu el sheirish ha'emuna ha'elyona, to raise us up to the ikar place of true emuna. And again, ve'emunascha balelos, emuna is an impossibility without encountering concealment. She tachlis hakol, and that is ultimately the purpose of all things. L'smoach b'simchas ha'emuna, to take joy in the simple joy of emuna, which is only possible down here in the dira b'tachtonim mamish, which corresponds to the vav in the middle of the aleph, which corresponds to Ratza Kadosh Baruch Hu Lios Lo Dir B'Tachtonim. It corresponds to Kula Kaima Kalei Chashiv, that absolutely nothing takes on any value in the face of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this is the aspect of Yismach Yisrael Ba'osav, the joy that a Jewish person takes simply in the fact that we have the capacity to have faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Sha'ashuei B'nei Yisrael Be'etzem Ha'emunah, the inner joy, the indescribable self-intoxication of the simple faith that a Jew has to grab hold of when things are difficult in the Dir B'Tachtonim. Shehi hasha'ashua ba'atzmus elikus kavyachol, which is in truth the pleasure and the joy that one takes in their access and their experience with the atzmus of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and like the Rebbe always does, with the addition of kavyachol, because we're never really talking about atzmus. Here is where the Rebbe brings us to the point that I love so deeply. This is the inyan of the Rikudim. This is the concept of dancing, that Mashiach Tzidkenu will teach us how to dance, a dance of the simple emunah, the simple faith. B'makom acher, and in another place, Biur Marenu, the tzaddik Rav Yitzchak Meir Morgenstern Shlita explains that this concept of drawing HaKadosh Baruch Hu down into the Dir B'Tachtonim, which is the loftiest level of Leis Aser Panim Minei, where we recognize that there is absolutely no place devoid of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence, no matter how low, no matter how concealed, that this joy that we take on the simple faith that is found in our experience down here, this is what is referred to in the language of Rabbi Nachman as Batlar She'en Lo Raglayim. This is the legless beggar. Sheyilmad Mashiach Tzidkenu Lirkoid B'Raglayim Shel Simchas HaEmunah, that Mashiach Tzidkenu is going to teach us how to dance the dance of simple faith. Now, famously in Rabbi Nachman's tale of the 7 beggars, the 13th tale of Sipurei Maisios, so we know that Rabbi Nachman introduces us to all 6 of the beggars, representative of 6 different tzaddikim, the Ushpizim Kadishin. We have the blind beggar, we have the deaf beggar, we have the stuttering beggar, we have the crooked neck beggar, we have the hunchback beggar, we have the handless beggar, but the person we never meet is the legless beggar. Rabbi Nachman ends the tale prior to the emergence of the legless beggar, that beggar who doesn't have legs. Now, within the history of Breslov Hasidus, there are various interpretations that in truth, this legless beggar is David Malka Mashiach, the one who dances with abandonment, who on the one hand is legless and floating in the air, but on the other hand has legs that are so powerful because they know how to dance the silent dance of Emunah that the world has not been ready to learn yet. And Be'ezras Hashem, Mashiach Tzidkenu, which is the Ragle Mashiach, we're mitzapeh to the legs of Mashiach. The Svarim tell us that Mashiach Tzidkenu himself is going to be the legless beggar, teaching us how to dance that dance in midair. That's the dance of Emunah, of not having any true sturdy ground to stand upon, because it's in truth the Dir B'Tachtonim, which is the site of Emunah. Emunah does not stand upon something sturdy or certain, but rather it floats in the air. It's a decision that a person has to make at every moment. One step forward, one step backwards. Ratza v'shov. That is the dance of the legless beggar, of learning how to dance in the air. This is the dance that emerges by the simple faith that we uncover not above, not below, not in the lower yud of Mamala Kalalman or the upper yud of Soiviv Kalalman, but rather in the vav of Ratza Kadosh Baruch Hu Lios Ladir B'Tachtonim, specifically down here. And it is this emuna and these dances that are metaknim u'ma'ilin es ha'emunah l'sheirasha ha'elyon, that in truth raise the lowest level of human experience to the highest, truly rightful place where it really rests, that brings the malchus, which is destitute and impoverished and dead, with its legs dangling in death, as the Zohar Kadosh tells us, ragleha yardamavis, it brings it back up to that lofty place that is suspended in midair of Reshad Lois Yada. Why? Because ha'emuna kshura el ha-raglayim kayadua. Because the raglayim are the lowest level, and so is emuna. Ubahagvas ha-raglayim b'simchas harikudim. But when a person raises their legs in the joy of dancing, mechavnim lahagviu laharim es ha'emuna. The intention that we have to have is to elevate our legs, the lowest place, up to its rightful place, to show us that the raglayim themselves are the real site of Avodas Hashem. Those places that are broken and burnt and bothered and are stuck in the dir b'tachtonim, that in truth is the loftiest site of human experience. And the Rebbe also continued to explain over there that this is also the aspect of dancing at a chasana. This is also why tzaddikim and all of us, we dance at chasanas. Why? Because at every single chasana, at every zivug, at every unification between the masculine expression and the feminine receptivity of expression and receiving, of running and returning, every time that there's a chasana, a yichud, it's me'ain or hayichud of kudshav yichud ul-asid. It's an aspect of the joy where we say in the Sheva Brachos that our joy should be the joy of Gan Eden. At every chasana, there's the tischach liyom acharon, the laughter of Gan Eden. And therefore, because we're tasting the future, roidkim b'nei Yisrael b'ragleihem al mitzias hachasan alakala. We're showing that we're dancing here over the light of Mashiach that is emerging, because the whole light of Mashiach, the whole light of Emunah, is the ability to dance, which is Meramez on the simcha of finding Emunah HaKadoshah, Malchus Ataras Bala, the revelation that what is lower is in truth higher. That which appears to be devoid of significance is in truth the most significant, because it's so significant that doesn't even need significance. And this is what the tzaddikim teach us, that in this time we learn how to dance the simple dance of faith, of simple faith, of faith in a place of confusion, of faith in a place of darkness, and that legless beggar, that recognition that yes, we can contemplate on Hashem's presence in this world, we can contemplate on Hashem's presence outside of this world, but the Iker Nakuda of Avodah is the darg of Malchus Agnuza Baradla, of realizing that wherever we are down here, as we exist in the concealment of Malchus, is in truth loftier than any other aspect of revelation. And this is something that the Rebbe's teachings speak about more than anybody else. How that which is below is in truth that which is most ascendant and most above. And Be'ezras Hashem, by having the simcha and emunah, and having emunah tzaddikim, and being zeicha to that mitzvah of minui hamelech, of being mechaber, the lower yud and the upper yud, and the kavanas of Elul, we should be zeicha to taste the te'ima of the emunah pshuta, of those sha'ashuim, of that joy that emerges specifically from the confines and the darkness of this worldly experience. Be'ezras Hashem.